For those of you just tuning in, 3 o'clock here in the East Coast, you're watching ABC News live coverage of the scene unfolding at Fort Lauderdale Airport this afternoon. A lone gunman, it's believed at this point that it was a lone gunman, walked into Terminal 2, the baggage claim, opening fire. At least 5 people were killed right there on the scene. It's believed at this point 8 people are injured, were hit also in the shooting in some way. 8 injuries. That number fluid all afternoon as we've been on the air, but at least 5 people dead. We knew early on from the Broward County Sheriff Department that they did believe they were dealing with multiple casualties and a number of fatalities, and we now know that that number is 5 people dead. And we've heard from eyewitnesses all afternoon here who describe the gunman walking through that baggage claim, opening fire, the cracking noise, the crackling noise of the gunfire, and the fact that workers who stood there and watched this unfold in horror and disbelief when they saw the gunman for themselves and had to dive behind the kiosks right there in the baggage claim. I'm joined by our chief investigative correspondent, Brian Ross, who's been here with me on the desk now for a couple of hours after we first learned of this unfolding situation. And as I was mentioning, Senator Nelson on the phone, this was reporting that we had not heard yet, but he'd been told by authorities right away that the suspect being led away, and we had an image of that, unclear if that's the actual suspect, but someone being led away, had a military ID on them, and that the name associated with it, he'd been told, was Esteban Santiago.
That's right, and federal law enforcement authorities and aviation security officials have told us that is the name they are working in now as the possible shooter. You want to caution that sometimes people end up with the ID of somebody else. If that is the name, he is a 26-year-old male, born in New Jersey, with addresses going back to Anchorage, Alaska.
Mm-hmm. And again, we caution that this is just initial reporting attached to the name that we had been given by Senator Nelson. Now federal authorities saying that that is in fact the name that at least early on they're going with and now investigating, but that's early word coming in on the individual we might be looking at. We certainly do not know if that's indeed the person, because as you point out, and smartly, oftentimes these IDs get mixed up, or a gunman will purposely have an ID
He'll steal it from somebody else.
Right. Chief Brown, when you look at these pictures and how intense the scene still is, as some of these pictures come in now, people down behind cars, the running that we see there, and it's hard to tell which ones are actually live and which ones are coming in from moments ago, but we have seen some frantic moments right up until just a short time ago. This is an unfolding situation, and this is what happens when you have additional reports of possible further incidents being reported. And that's often the case after an incident, given the chaos, and we heard of the shouting and the screaming, people so concerned.
Yes, the anxiety levels of people when you have these type of incidents just raises to the highest level, and any loud noise from here forward throughout the day will cause reactions like this, where people just will start running when they hear a loud bang or a scaffold fall, or some worker maybe drops something and makes just a loud banging noise. And people pretty much, their psychology of, I'm not safe in this area, it causes you to run and do things, hunker down, and law enforcement have to react to these types of witness accounts that they heard a loud noise, they thought it might be shooting, and so you have to treat them all as if they're real critical incidents happening throughout the day.
And I want to get back to Pierre Thomas, Chief Brown, who's with us. He's our senior justice correspondent, because, Pierre, you're learning something new from your sources?
Yeah, again, the federal source that I spoke to had that name that Senator Nelson gave us on our air. They can make sure that they're looking at the actual shooter, know exactly who that person is, and their complete background. The FBI, Homeland Security, Secret Service, multiple law enforcement agencies checking their databases to see what they can find out about this particular name, again, trying to match it with the individual in custody.
Yeah, using extreme care in investigating the name, federal sources are telling us, which is why we are being careful. Of course, that name is just one of the early indicators of what's been gleaned from that one military ID that they found on the suspect. But as Brian Ross pointed out earlier, so as is often the case, sometimes these military IDs are stolen or purposely meant to throw off law enforcement in the early hours after an incident like this. I want to bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, who's reported extensively on the military for many, many years. And Martha, I know the reaction almost immediately when we hear about a military ID is a difficult one, because these are the men and women who serve this country. military and put their lives on the line and all over the world. And when we hear that it could be a member of the military who could be involved in this, it's a difficult headline.
It certainly is, David. It's something we're looking into. We're trying to find out more about this name from the Pentagon.
Martha, thank you. I want to bring in Mark Lee, another eyewitness who's with us. And Mark, what can you tell us you saw?
Basically, I was on the far end of the baggage claim terminal. We realized that there was an active shooter in the building. People started yelling and screaming at the time. Like I say, he basically had a 9mm gun, went through probably at least a couple dozen rounds. By the time he was done shooting there, he was basically threw the gun down on the ground and basically was laying spread eagle face down on the ground there. He had no intention of running out of the building.
That's the first time we've heard a description like that. So again, you say it would appear that he was using a 9mm gun. He'd opened fire in the terminal, and then he was down on the ground. Were you able to see? Were you able to see how this came to an end? How they were able to?
Oh yeah. I watched him. I was at that point. I was about probably 20 feet away from him by that time.
And so how was he detained?
He basically once he was done with ammunition, I was out of the gun. He threw his gun down the road, which I was about 10 feet away from him, and he basically threw the gun on the ground, and he laid on the ground face down, spread eagle. So he was already down. He was waiting for the officer to approach him.
That's what I was getting at earlier. We had not heard that description yet. Mark Lee, who's inside the terminal. Mark, we really appreciate you talking with us, and you're very calm for having just helped so many people in the middle of that storm. But as you heard Mark Lee, an eyewitness there at the airport, just described, the gunman walking into that terminal, then turning right, opening fire indiscriminately at men and women, he said. And this eyewitness says when the shooting was finished, that he was standing a mere 10 feet away from the gunman, who he said appeared to have run out of ammunition, was then on the ground, face down, laying down on the ground. And he said, in fact, he was there lying on the ground waiting for law enforcement when they finally get on the scene, Brian.
That's right, and we're getting a second report that it was a handgun that was used, not a long rifle, not a semi-automatic weapon.
This is different, though, from what we have seen in the past as far as him appearing to be finished with what he could do and then simply waiting for authorities to arrive.
Right. That is not how a suicide bomber, a terrorist, an ISIS-inspired attacker behaves. This appears to be something different from early indications, and we're told that he is in custody and he is talking with authorities now.
And what we don't know, obviously, at this point, was whether or not he had more weaponry, more ammunition, just could use it, or if he simply walked in, used what he had, and then was finished with the terror he was inflicting on the people inside that airport. Some time ago, Florida Senator Bill Nelson joining us on the phone, and he told us that almost immediately after taking this lone gunman, it's believed to be a lone gunman, one shooter, into custody, that they almost immediately found a military ID. And Brian Ross, our chief investigative correspondent, and his team has been looking into what matches up with that ID, although you're doing it with extreme caution.
But in this case, federal law enforcement authorities seem to have made a match, according to what we're being told now, between that name and this suspect. And of course, if he was in the military, there will be fingerprint records which can be rather rapidly checked.
The fingerprints will certainly help, because
thank you very much. Please follow us at Broward Sheriff on Twitter.
Can you briefing
again? I'm not sure.
You've been listening to the Broward County Sheriff's Department and the FBI joining forces there, answering questions about what's transpired in Fort Lauderdale. Those are pictures of people at the perimeter of the airport, and they were explaining just moments ago that this is what they had to do, a standard operating procedure after a deadly incident like what we witnessed early this afternoon in Fort Lauderdale. I'll take you through this if you're tuning in now about what we just heard from authorities there on the scene. The first call came in at around 12:55, shortly before 1, of an active shooter. When they arrived on the scene, they saw that the shooter had hit at least 13 people there in Terminal 2, the baggage claim area of the airport. 8 of them are now at area hospitals. They did not know the extent of their injuries, could not offer that at this time, but 8 have been taken to area hospitals. They talked about the 5 that we had reported on earlier this afternoon, 5 people dying when that shooter came into Terminal 2. One eyewitness telling me that he walked into the doors, turned right, and then just simply began firing. That shooter is now in custody. Authorities were quick to point out that the shooter was unharmed. That means they're questioning him as we speak. It's something we had talked about earlier here, and that is in fact what they're doing already, being interviewed by FBI agents and investigators right there on the ground in Broward County. We did listen to them also talking about operations at the airport. We've been reporting this afternoon that operations had come to a halt. Those operations remain suspended. They did say they would alert the public, and we'll pass it along to you as soon as operations are back up and running there at the airport. One thing I do want to get to, though, is news that this was someone who flew in on a flight and got to Fort Lauderdale. Brian Ross, you had reported this just before we turned to the authorities to get more on this. And we're learning more about where this gunman might have been flying in from.
There were initial reports, perhaps Canada, perhaps Anchorage.
I do want to bring in David Curley, who covers aviation. He's been with us all afternoon. And David, just remind us, if you would, about the rules about carrying guns on airplanes. This was a legally checked gun that was then loaded once he got to the airport, according to the commissioner. You heard him just moments ago here.
And according to TSA rules, if you are flying in the United States, if you are going to an airport, yes, in a hard-cased plastic or some other hard case, you can put an unloaded weapon and ammunition in that locked box and check it. Now, it has to be smaller caliber. It can't be anything larger than .75 caliber, no shotgun shells, but small arms ammunition can be loaded with an unloaded weapon in a hard case and checked at an airport. And then you have to tell the folks when you check in at the counter, I have a weapon, it's in this hard case, here it is. You can put a TSA lock on it and TSA will check it.
Again, because this is checked luggage.
Correct.
With a legally checked in unloaded gun. It gets checked by TSA, but not the TSA that we're all familiar with when we walk through that line for our carry-on luggage. This is taken by the ticketing agent, and then that gun would be checked out by TSA.
So TSA, you see them when you're going through the security checkpoint. But in the baggage area, you see the belts go by behind the ticket counter, and those belts carry the luggage sometimes into a basement, depending on the size of the airport. And there are TSA officers in the back, in the basement, in the background. When these bags come by, they take them off the belt and they actually go through them. If you've had a bag checked like that, you normally find a piece of paper inside when you arrive at your destination that says the TSA was in that checked piece of baggage and looked at it and then sent it along its way.
So perfectly legal, and we just want to reconfirm that that's what the authorities had said, and that it was only when he arrived at the airport that the commissioner then told us moments ago that he went into a bathroom, and that's where he loaded the gun. I want to turn back to Brian Ross, because what we were talking about when we first came on the air were these federal warnings about lone wolves, and what we have witnessed not too long ago in Istanbul and in Brussels at the airport. But these were people approaching the ticketing areas and the so-called soft areas of the airport. This is different. This is, it would appear, someone with a military ID who flew into Fort Lauderdale Airport with a legally checked gun in luggage that would then be checked by the TSA once the ticketing agent marks the bag, sends it down the conveyor belt. And that it wasn't until he arrived at Fort Lauderdale Airport, got off the plane with everybody else, presumably, and then walked into a bathroom, according to the commissioner, and that's where he loaded that gun. This is a different scenario from something that we've reported on before.
That's right, and I think one of the nuances here, David, and I think Chief Brown will confirm this, that if it was clearly a case of terrorism, the FBI would take over. They'd be the lead agency. We now know that the suspect boarded a plane last night in Anchorage, Alaska, changed planes in Minneapolis, and then flew on into Fort Lauderdale today. According to what we've been able to research so far, born in New Jersey in 1990, but with numerous addresses and residences in Anchorage.
8 people at the hospital, 5 dead on the scene. We will continue to report on this throughout the evening. We'll have team coverage coming up on World News Tonight, a special edition at 6:30 Eastern. In the meantime, for many of you, your local news with team coverage coming up on this horrific situation in Fort Lauderdale. Good day.
This has been a special report.